Is reading fiction good for you? Is reading fiction a waste of time? Is reading fiction important? Do you know, if you were to type those sentences into Google, you can get around 250 million search results from that. Have you ever asked one of those questions? Maybe that's why you found this video. Or have you heard someone ask that kind of question? Well, in this video, we're going to take a look at the answer to those questions. And all I ask of you, if you want to learn, is stick around with me to the end, because the answer will probably be very eye-opening and fascinating for you. So, without further ado, let's get stuck in, shall we? Hello out there, all my bookish friends in BookTube land, and welcome to another episode of Tristan and the Classics. Excuse my nasal congestion, I have actually come down with COVID, so there you have it. But let's get on with this question about whether reading fiction is worthwhile, or is it a complete waste of time? It's a more and more common attitude that you seem to find in this day and age, that reading fiction is a load of nonsense. If you go onto Reddit, which is very much like YouTube in that you can go down all sorts of rabbit holes and end up who knows where, this question comes up a lot, or the statement comes up. One person said, just like watching movies all the time, reading fiction is just a black hole of wasted time. Okay, you can sort of understand the argument there, where they're coming from. Somebody else that I read said that they're an avid reader of non-fiction. They read science and culture and history books. And then they said they don't like fiction because of its low density of information, which I thought was a rather Radaman-themed stance to take on this topic. But I'm sure you've heard statements like it, and I certainly can sympathise where people are coming from. And a lot of people, I've noticed, they're not quite sure how to answer this. They may deeply love fiction and classic literature, but not be sure how to defend it against those who hold up non-fiction as superior in every respect. So that's what we're going to look at in this video. Now, to start with, what I want to say is the frequent answer to this challenge, when someone says, reading fiction is a waste of time, the frequent response is very symptomatic of the world we live in, and actually shows a very severe blind spot in most people's awareness of the society they live in and their own thinking. We all have privately based assumptions which we're sort of unconscious of. And this is one of them, because very often you'll find that the answer, is fiction a waste of time, will be, no it's not, because it's been scientifically demonstrated that if you read lots of fiction, you work both hemispheres of the brain, and this creates in you a better rhythm of logic, maybe, or being able to perceive the abstract. Other answers may focus on studies and research that have shown the benefits of reading fiction with those with mental health disorders, or those who maybe have autism, and the effect that reading fiction can have on them. And then there's always the classic, it gives you empathy, the ability to share feelings with others, which is a very, very valid point. But there is something intrinsically more valuable about fiction than most people realise, than most people have ever stopped to think about. And partly, like I say, that's because of the way our society has engineered our priorities in life. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to step away from the camera now, and I want to draw a little diagram on a piece of paper for you, and I'll chat as I'm drawing and you follow along and see what you think. So, the way I'd like to talk about where fiction fits in with us is to have a look in broad principle at how we experience being alive, like the areas in which we operate as humans. And to do that, I'm going to just use 4 basic rudimentary areas. So, our first one we'll put over here is an orange circle, okay? And that orange circle stands for history. So, in our experience as human beings, we have a history. It deals with the where do we come from. and to a degree a certain amount of how did we get here. Okay, so that's one area of our existence as humans that influences us. Now, the next area, we have, let's put it over here, big purple circle, and we'll call this science. Okay, we'll say science. And this is particularly the physical sciences. Okay, it deals with the measurable. Okay, the measurable, our world. It looks at how things work, the actual how of things. So explaining down to the atoms and giving us electricity and steam power and iPads and Tesla motor cars. This is what science gives us. And we all have an interest in logical things and things we can measure and deduce and repeat continuously. But that's not the only part of our existence. Another part of our existence is what we'll put in this blue one, which is, for want of a better word, metaphysics. So meta meaning above the physical, okay? So inside metaphysics, we're going to be looking at things like philosophy, things like religion. This deals, in our experience as human beings, this deals with the why. So you could say, where is history? How is science of the natural world around us? Metaphysics is the why, okay? So that might be, why is there something rather than nothing? Why is there suffering? Why do we behave in particular ways? Okay. And then our final broad area, broad category, we'll put that one down the bottom in pink, beautiful pink. And that is our desires. Okay. Our intrinsic desires and lusts for life. Okay, so this is just what we like to experience. Okay, our enjoyment comes out of this. It gives us a certain direction in our life. Now, looking at all of those, no one pops into one only. We all have a link to these four categories of life. Okay? Now, some may fall into one category or have a propensity to one category more than another. But these are all four categories that we work within, okay? But it's this bit in the middle, which is where fiction lies. In fact, it's where art lies. You see, art in the middle, I've got no other colours. I did have a green, but it's gone. So, oh, there's one. Right. This bit in here, we'll do it in green. It's the arts. And what this deals with is what it is to be human. So history can tell us where, as humans, we came from, what things we may have tried before, what calamities we've gone through, what prosperities, what good successes we've had. Metaphysics can reason about why we think the way we do, why there is meaning in life, why there is something rather than nothing. This is meaning. Our desires are the things that keep us entertained and provide pleasure through our days, and they're important to us. And the science is the how of the world that we live in. Okay? It may even be how we work, such as anatomy. It could be genetics. But none of those four can tell you what it is to be you at this moment in time. Art does that. The art is the experiential part of being a human. It's sort of the confluence of these four broad categories. We don't, like I say, live in these categories. They're actually part of one experience. And that's where art is fundamental to us.
So, I hope that was simple enough. It was a very broad, crude, you could say, jotting out of our experiences in life, those four areas. But could you see where literature fits? And the answer, therefore, of why fiction matters. Why it's not a waste of time. Because, to riff off the comment I used earlier from someone on Reddit, Fiction is high density information about what it means to be a human being. And how could you say that that's valueless? Okay? What happens is that through history, societies tend to elevate some areas of life as more important than the others. And ultimately, whatever benefits they bring, if you get a dominant society, a dominant culture that grows, it normally ends up elevating desires as the final stage, which is decadence, because it doesn't produce anything. It loses sight of everything. But let's just give you an example. If you have a society like ours that elevates science a lot, then people want to have the how to do things, how to get results, how this, how that, okay? Everything becomes about production, about progress, okay? And when we're talking progress, we tend to be financial and technological progress. Now, one of the weaknesses about that, it may on the face of it look like, well, what's the problem? Well, if everything is always accomplishing, it knocks out elements of who we are as human beings. Now, a good example of this is in the 19th century, in the Industrial Revolution, science obviously was revered because of the great advances it was making to society. But at the same time, measuring everything, making everything scientific, led to the term hands in one situation. So people who worked in a factory weren't called men and women, they were called hands, as in what mattered about them to the owners of the industrial factories. Just their hands to operate the machine, because XYZ equals cash. Okay? Purely scientific. You've took out any meaning of what it is to be a human. Okay? And this is something that fiction brings out and causes a reform. If you have a society that was purely metaphysical, a result could be a highly puritanical society, for instance, who exclude desires of the flesh in favour of intellectual and righteous achievements, all that kind of stuff, religious, okay? There's a revolt because that's not what it is to be a human. It's an aspect of what makes us human. But if we elevate just one area, we destroy the total human being. Now, interestingly, philosophy in the Renaissance and religion led to the Renaissance. And that's where this classical form of logic really came into the fore and led to the scientific progress of those cultures. But strangely enough, there was a kickback from people because they didn't want everything to be just pure logic, hard, all the time, with no movement for being a human. That's why people revolted, because we're not just pure thinking, calculating machines. And do you know what the response was? It was romanticism. Romanticism kicked against everything having to be logical and hard proven. And do you know where they put their emphasis? On history, of all things. They look back to simpler times, and you get the writers like Walter Scott, and you get Keats and Wordsworth, all these ones coming up. History is elevated there. But if you got stuck on history only, you wouldn't have progress, okay? So, do you see how everything has to work together? And so, wherever people lean in these quadrants, they often try to argue about why their ideas are better. But the fiction writer tells you what it is to be human. And fiction, in some respects, has had more power on society than anything else. Think right the way back to the beginning of time. Humans have told stories through dance, through art, through the spoken word, through the written word, okay? It's actually called history, okay? Because we discover ourselves in fiction, in fictional forms. And I talk more about fictional forms on my Patreon, Tristan and the Classics over on Patreon. There's a video coming up about the power of form in fiction and how it shapes society. But to give you an example of just how powerful fiction is and that it is important, think of this. There was a situation in which there was slavery, as we know, in the 19th century. Now, on the one side, you had some of the metaphysics, some of the philosophers and some of the evangelicals arguing philosophically about the need to get rid of, and morally about the need to get rid of slavery because it's something wicked, and it was a very intellectual way of explaining it. At the same time, you had works of science like The Descent of Man, which were like overtly racist, but were pushed forward as being scientific. Okay, but what did it exclude? It excludes the human. What actually made the biggest movements towards the abolition of slavery and getting the public on board and it being the venture to drive it away? Well, think of this. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was fiction, but presenting realities for people to experience. And when people read Uncle Tom's Cabin, their hearts tore open. They were incensed at slave owners and the brutality of these slavers. Okay? Do you see the power there? And when people experienced it in a tight form, it galvanized movements. And then you had Frederick Douglass giving his autobiographical account, which is story. Okay, it's not fiction, but it's still story like fiction. This is what changed society. You think of the poor and the downtrodden classes, the workhouses, the dying children in the streets of 19th century Europe. There were arguments about not supporting them from the scientific community. Some from the scientific community argued for supporting. The philosophical arguments came in. The historical arguments came in. But do you know what made the biggest difference? It was art. When Charles Dickens wrote Oliver Twist, the national outcry was stupendous and moved to reforms. So valuable is the experiential quality of fiction, good fiction, that Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli used it. You think of his works like Vivian Grey and Coningsby and Sybil. These are stories in which he examines the plight of the poor. Rather than this cold, calculated aspect of humanity, he jumps in and says, this is being a human. And now when you read it and you become a human in that situation, you will react more powerfully than from any other area. As a final element of showing the importance of fiction and that it's not a waste of time, I just want to share something else from Reddit. Now, I was reading through many Reddit comments about fiction being a waste of time, and one of them said, since I only have a finite amount of time, it'd be better for me to spend 1,000 pages reading 1,000 pages of applied chemistry than 1,000 pages of fiction. Now let me use some literature to answer that, okay? And I say it with all respect. It's actually in the scriptures, okay, that there's this little parable given by Jesus, and he says that there's this rich man and he makes storehouses, lots of grain, and then he's not content with that, so he grows more grain and builds more storehouses and gets super duper rich and says, okay, soul, you've got a great load laid up for you to enjoy in your later life. Great, now take it easy. And then, he's told you're going to die this night. So what is the value of his life? He has all those storehouses full of wonderful things, but he's going to drop dead. Okay? If you change the storehouses for applied chemistry, or for knowing how to make millions of pounds, or for knowing how to govern a country, or if that's all you've got and then you die, what does it mean? Okay? Now, that is bringing you close to actually thinking about yourself. This parable, the reason I bring it up, is essentially the idea behind Tolstoy's The Death of Ivan Ilyich, where you just see a man at the final part of his days, and what is his life amounted to? Do you know you could learn more from reading that than from a book on applied chemistry? That's not to say chemistry isn't important. If you put all your emphasis on fiction, you will impoverish a culture. But if you put all your emphasis away from fiction, you'll impoverish it too, because people won't know anything about themselves. So is reading fiction important? On an individual level, yes it is. But then that sort of depends as well on the quality of the fiction. But should you be reading non-fiction? Absolutely, and I'll cover that in a different video. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please leave your comments down below, and like I say, excuse if there's any muddledness in this. It's because I'm a bit groggy in the head with COVID. So thank you for bearing with me. Until the next time that I see you, I wish you joy in your reading.